Hi friends, welcome to episode number 2 of our Master Planning Level 1 series. In this episode number 2, we will discuss in detail about the planning strategies. We will explore about what is a static plan and dynamic plan and what is a one plan strategy and two plan strategy. These are basically some of the jargons used by planners to confuse us. So in this episode, we will discuss in detail and understand what are these concepts are all about. With that note, let's quickly jump into today's topic. So let's quickly get into today's topic. So in the episode number 2, we will be discussing in detail about the strategies and key concepts. So in order to understand what is a planning strategy, you need to understand what kind of possibilities which we have as far as master planning is concerned, right? So first we need to understand the master plans which need to be defined and what are the types of master plan which you can define in the setup. So the types of master plan that are used by master planning explains which plan strategy you should use depending on your business requirement. So primarily you need to decide what is your business requirement and needs are, based on which you need to define the master plan and configure it in the master planning parameters. And imagine master plan, when planners are trying to do this, imagine master plan typically like a bad job which kind of fetches the appropriate signals from your system and then executes the planned orders, right? Try to keep the concepts very simple. That's what we are trying to achieve in this series of videos, and use various master plans to support your company's daily working operations. Simulate different planning strategies that you want to monitor, right? So in some cases you might need to have different dynamic plans so that you can simulate the various possible scenarios based on the seasonality of the requirements, and based on which you can tweak the planned orders and then firm the appropriate orders to plan your supplies. And so like we discussed in the episode number 1, the deprecated master planning engine uses two types of plans, which is basically a static plan and the dynamic plan. Do not worry about that. We will be quickly understanding about what is the difference between a static plan and dynamic plan in Dynamics 365. But the important point which I want to highlight here is, in order to have a best performance for the master planning engine to run, you need to configure appropriate plan for your business specific scenarios. So you cannot be putting complex configurations of this static plan and dynamic plan and expect the system to perform at its best, right? So let me go to the next slide. So as we talked about the difference between the static plan and the dynamic plan, so this is what exactly it means. So when we are configuring the master plan in your system, so we will quickly see that you can configure various master plans in the system and use the appropriate one which suits your business needs. But importantly, in the master planning parameters, you need to configure what is the static plan and the dynamic plan which you want to use. So what's the difference? So static plans are basically the long-term plans. Based on my experience, these plans are primarily or done for more than 30 days or 60 days or so. In some of the manufacturing organizations, these static plans are done for more than 6 months. But in case of dynamic plans are basically short-term plans which are done for maybe for 7 days to 14 days, not more than that. So it is primarily less than 30-day plan, right? And the static plan also remains unchanged regardless of any changes in the supply and demand until the next time that master planning is run. So let's imagine like this: you run your master planning today on Jan 1st, and on Jan 15th you got a demand for a specific item number, but until you run the master planning again, the demand which you received on Jan 15 is not considered for your planned orders, right? So but the good part here is static plan typically considers the supply and demand forecast. So let's say that's why we said if you are considering the forecast for the next 3 to 4 months, which is a long-term plan for which it is primarily best to consider the static plans rather than the dynamic plans. So the system tries to consider the plan which you have configured in case of the static plan for the long-term planning. And then the static plan supports regeneration. Primarily, we will touch upon what is the concept of regeneration quickly in this video. Make sure that you continue to watch this video so that you will understand what's the concept of regeneration actually means. And last thing about static plan is a totally new optimized plan is calculated every time that master planning is run. and existing orders that haven't been firmed or deleted, which is the most important point as far as the static plan is concerned. So let's say if there are existing orders which are created, let's say we run the master planning engine on Jan 1st, and once again we run the master planning engine on Jan 30th. So whatever the existing planned orders which got created, which are not firmed or primarily deleted, and whatever the changes which are kind of, let's say we got a demand in Jan 15, that is also considered in order to generate the revised planned orders, right? So totally a new optimized plan is calculated every time when the master planning engine is run, right? So that's where the static plan comes into play. When we talk about dynamic plan, like I said, it's a short-term plan. It usually starts as a copy of the static plan. Let's say you have a planned orders which is generated. It takes a copy of that, but it can be updated every time that the master data changes. Let's say you have a peak demand, which is like our previous example, we have a peak demand on Jan 15th, right? So in case of any ad hoc planning which need to be done for to meet your short-term demands, in those cases you primarily run the dynamic plans. It lets company monitor the changing order network and item availability without disturbing the static plan. Let's say, imagine like this, you have a static plan which is running and giving you the long-term demand, and then at the same time you have some seasonal requirements coming up in the middle of the overall delivery. So you want to cater to those needs also. So in those cases you need to kind of run the dynamic plans. And also the important note here is dynamic plan typically tends to consider the net changes, whatever is kind of getting into your demand. So whatever the net changes which are coming in during the course of the time, typically the dynamic plan considers those and provides the appropriate planned orders. So typically this helps you to kind of meet the CTP, capable to promise, what is that you will be able to promise to the customer based on the variations in the demand signals, right? So that's the primary difference between what is a static plan and dynamic plan. But first let me get into the system and show you how to configure this. So in Dynamics 365, so if you get into master planning module, let me collapse. So if you get into master planning module, first of all, if you go to setup under plans, you need to configure the master plans, and by default in the demo data we will already have a dynamic plan and a static plan in place. But right now the naming convention is kept like this for ease of understanding for the users. But even if you want to keep a plan 1 or plan 2, just make sure that you name it appropriately, and then you have to configure this. Let's say if you have created a master plan with the name as dynamic plan, the main difference between the dynamic plan and static plan is in terms of 3 configurations, I would say. If you look at the static plan, it generally includes the supply forecast and demand forecast. That's what we kind of discussed. That's what we have mentioned in the slide also, that it typically includes the supply and demand forecast. But if you look at the dynamic plan, it does not include the supply and demand forecast. So in this case, your supply forecast transaction or the demand forecast transactions are not considered if you are actually running a dynamic plan, because having said that, this is a short-term plan. And also, if you look at static plan, the next important point to note here is generally it considers the finite capacity with a time fence of more than 30 days. Typically it will be around 60 to 90 days, or even some organizations I have seen, they are making a plan for more than 100 days. So that is possible if you are working in an automotive or manufacturing industry. So the finite capacity time fence decides on until when you need to plan your overall master planning engine based on the transactions which you have in the system. So typically the same thing, if you look at the dynamic plan, the capacity time fence which is primarily planned is less than 14 or 15 days for typically, which means a short-term plan for a week. Sometimes I have seen these kind of time fence plan for less than 7 days in order to meet any specific seasonal demands and requirements. So this is the primary difference, I would say. How do you configure the capacity, and you are not actually including the supply and demand forecast. And once let's say you configure the static plan and dynamic plan in your system, and then you need to assign this in the master planning parameter. So if you go to setup, click on master planning parameters, so under the general section, if you see what is the current forecast plan and what is the current static master plan and what is the current dynamic master plan. So you need to configure the appropriate master plans here, so that the system, whenever it runs the master planning engine, it makes sure that it takes the appropriate plan from the parameters and then provide the appropriate plan and then generate the planned orders, right? So make sure that first you create a master plan under the setup, and then once you create the master plan, you need to configure the static plan and the dynamic plan over here, right? So let's go back to the slide. So that is about the static plan and dynamic plan. So next particular concept which we need to understand is how do we once we generate the plan, how the master planning engine need to do the calculations, whether primarily we will discuss on two major areas. One is regeneration and net change. So like I said in the previous slide, regeneration is the planning method which is used for static, and net change is the method which is primarily used for dynamic. So let's say if we are running a regeneration method, in those cases what exactly happens is, so you need to kind of delete the planned order. So when you're running the planning method as regeneration, the planned orders are generated unless they are deleted if they are not firmed, right? So that's typically used in case of static plans. If you have not firmed, those orders are generated, and based on your changes, all the new orders are generated and along with the forecast. So in case of the dynamic plan, that's not the case. You are not generating the planned orders based on the forecast, right? And in case of regeneration, it generates new planned orders based on all the requirements. So let's say you run the master planning on Jan 30th, based on all the month requirement and also based on the forecast, it generates the planned orders. But in case of net change, whatever the changes which are applied compared to the previous last master plan run, let's say if you look at the definition, the net change planning method generates planned orders to cover the requirements that have been created or changed since the last master planning run. So let's say you already run the master planning engine on Jan 1st and you have a demand which is on Jan 15th, and you run the master planning engine again on Jan 30th. So the engine is now going to consider only the changes which are coming into the system, and it is not going to make any changes to those already the transactions which are run on Jan 1st, right? So in changes in supply are not considered when this method is run, right? So changes in demand is considered, but changes in supply are not considered. This is a very, very important point which you need to keep in mind, right? And if you want to know how to assign the planning method, let me go to the system. So here, if you get into master planning, if you want to run the master planning, like I said, imagine master planning like a batch job. So to not confuse yourself as a very complex concept, imagine master planning as a batch job for which you provide some appropriate inputs based on which it provides the output as a planned orders, right? So if you go to master planning, you can run the master planning from here, or even if you go to master planning workspace, I guess that is a workspace. Yeah, even if you go to the master planning workspace, from the master planning workspace also you will be able to run the batch job. If you click on run, you can see, so here we can decide which particular plan which you want to run, whether you want to run a static plan or a dynamic plan, and then you need to assign the planning method, right? So here by default the method is regeneration. So I want to raise this question in this video. So how do you actually change? I just want you guys to go and explore how to change this, why we are not allowed, why this particular field is disabled for us to change from regeneration to net change. Do some study around this and let me know your thoughts in comment section, and I'll be happy to read it out. So here, this is where you need to capture the planning method, whether it is a regeneration or net change, and then based on which the master planning engine runs. But let me know your thoughts in comment section why we are unable to change this planning method, right? Let me go back to the slide. The next important topic which we need to discuss is the planning strategies. Once we kind of define the planning, the master plans are configured in your system, then we need to decide as an organization whether we are going to opt for one plan strategy or a two plan strategy. So what's the difference between one plan strategy and two plan strategy? So as we progress in this series of master planning, we will try to understand the various jargons used by the planners. The planners tend to use all these jargons and try to confuse us, but we'll try to demystify all those with the simple language so that it is easy for the layman to understand, right? So what is the difference between one plan and a two plan? So if it is a one plan strategy, generally what happens is you use the same master plan for both static plan and dynamic plan. So imagine like this. So in the example which we saw before, we created separate plans. The system already had separate plans for static plan and the dynamic plan. So instead of having separate plans for static plan and dynamic plan, you put the same plan for both static plan and dynamic plans. So that is primarily called as one plan strategy. It is typically used in those scenarios where you have a make to stock kind of business operations, where you primarily stock the material and then sell it. Especially these kind of scenarios are used in case of retail and distribution organizations. But in case of two plan strategy, you use a specific plan for static and a specific plan for dynamic. So typically these are kind of used where you have the business scenarios to configure to order or make to order, especially in terms of automotive industry. That's the best example which I can give, where you kind of receive the orders. You may need to configure your engine or the variants, and based on which you deliver the products to the customers. In those cases, a two plan strategy makes sense, because where you need to keep in mind of the short term demand and also the long term demand for those item request. So in those cases, the two plan strategy is used, and also two plan strategies are used in case if you want to run any basic simulations. Let's say you may find some seasonal demands, especially during some period of the year. So if you want to run some simulations using a short-term dynamic plan, in those cases it is better to have two plan strategy rather than having a one plan strategy, right? So that's the primary difference between what is a one plan strategy and a two plan strategy. But I will also quickly make you understand how to configure this. So to use one plan strategy, select the same plan in the current static master plan and the current dynamic master plan fields. Let me go back to D365. So let's say you decide to go ahead with static plan, right? So then how to configure that in the system? One plan strategy. If you have decided to configure the one plan strategy, if you go to setup, go to master planning parameters, and then what you have to do is you put the same master plan in both the static master plan and the dynamic master plan. So if I configure this as a dynamic plan and then hit the save button, so this is now tend to behave as a one plan strategy. But instead, if I try to use a different plan for static plan and the dynamic master plan, then the system understands it as a two plan strategy, right? So you tend to use something for short term and something for a long term. So that's the primary difference of how do we configure the one plan strategy and two plan strategy in the system. Let me go back. So this is the next important concept which you need to understand, and also the next important concept which we need to understand as part of the strategies, or this is primarily related to production orders. So I just actually don't want to touch upon this, but at a very high level I want to give you an idea of what is the difference between operation scheduling and a job scheduling. But we are not going to focus on this, because in this series of videos we will be focusing only on the planned purchase order generations and some of the basic configurations related to planned purchase orders, but not related to planned production orders, right? And but the question here is, because this is one of the important concepts which we need to understand as we progress, so that's the reason we are touching it at a very high level. So operation scheduling, you can use operation scheduling to provide a general estimate of production process over time. So imagine like this: if you have the processes of the production, various processes, let's say you are manufacturing a shirt, you need to get the fabric, you need to kind of do the stitching operations, and if there are any washing operations which need to be performed, and then packing operations. So there are various processes which need to be performed as you manufacture the shirt, right? So as you do that, you do the operation level scheduling. What is the estimated time to complete the operation at a very high level? But when you do the operation scheduling, it does not explode the operations for the production route into jobs. So if you want to explore the operations at the production route into jobs, let's say at the resource level, if you want to do the exploration, let's say if I do the stitching of the shirt in multiple machines and then multiple laborers are working, and you have the capacity to manage it and monitor it at the job level, then you primarily need to use the job scheduling. But at the operation level, if you are going to do that explode of the operations, then primarily this is not required. So right, so if you want to include more detail in the scheduling, such as information about current capacity, you can run the job scheduling after you run operation scheduling. So if you want more detail on the kind of operations that you perform, it's better to run the job scheduling. But of course, it kind of has an impact in the overall performance if you are kind of putting complex jobs and sub bombs are involved, right? So let's not deep dive into these two concepts, but I have a short image which will kind of explain you in detail what is the primary difference between operation scheduling and job scheduling. So imagine like this. So as you run the production order, right, you first estimate the production order. So when you do the estimate, the explosion does not happen at the resource level. So it happens at the operation, and you do not have a defined start date and the end date during which the jobs will be completed, right? But if you are running the master planning based on the operation scheduling, then you at the resource level also you will be assigning the process in which it need to be executed. So based on which when the explosion happens, the resources also considered along with the start date and the end date, right? So in this case, let's say if you perform a cutting operation, it is primarily performed using a resource 001, and what is the start date and the end date. So if you use the operation scheduling, it does the explosion up to the resource. But if you do the job scheduling even within the resource, let's say the cutting machine, you need to use 00101, 00102. So you need to use couple of resources, and that at the job level, what is the start date and end date, and what is the start time and end time. If at this granular level, if you want to get into the details, then you primarily need to use job scheduling. But ideally, most of the organizations I have seen that it is fine to do an operation scheduling rather than job scheduling, and that will suffice most of your business requirements. So hope that concept is clear, but this is not going to have a lot of impact as far as we progress in the series. Probably as we get into the planned production order series, we will discuss in detail about this. And so with that, we are coming to end of this episode number 2. In the episode number 3, we will start covering in detail more about the master planning concepts. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel D365 Talks or follow my profile in LinkedIn. Thank you.